companies such as things like Cylance, that I'm sure many of you have heard of. But he's here today to talk a little bit about SentinelOne and some of the pioneering work there. And maybe I'll just let you take it from here.
Thanks, Patrick.
So thank you, Raj.
And thanks, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of my career goals and journey with this group. So I kind of came up with this title, and I think I kind of owe an explanation to everyone about how I computed this $50 billion number. And then we'll get into what I'm going to talk about. So there are at least 3 companies that did some pioneering work. I happen to work for 2 of them, both of which, at exit valuation, if you add up, adds up to about $10 billion. And then there is one company that I never worked for that's really, really successful, and it's called CrowdStrike, and they contribute the other 40. So my contributions are relatively small compared to what others have done, but I've had the luck of having a ringside seat to whatever happened the last 10, 15 years. And a lot has happened, especially in the use of machine learning and data science in security. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. But this is a red talk, and I'm told that red talks are different. My expectation when I first got the invite from Tom was, oh my God, is this like a TED talk? I'm not as polished a speaker. So what is it that I'm going to do differently? And I'm going to leave you with at least 2 interesting things, one of which will hopefully help you with your career, and took me tens of years to learn that. And the other thing hopefully will help you improve your quality of life. And again, it took me multiple years to learn that. And I'm going to give you both of those nuggets towards the very end for those of you who stay. So let's actually start with the security part. And I was just telling my story about how I got into security. It was not something that I set to do. I was trying to commercialize a piece of technology from here, UW, that's called Condor. I used to be Miron's grad student, and a few of us together tried starting a company. And the short story is that didn't really pan out for us, so we just kind of left and called our friends, and one of them placed me in a security company. And then over the years, I just stuck with security for the most part. But let me kind of walk you through what really happened in security over the years, especially as it relates to the small AV antivirus that many of you may be running or maybe not running. If most of you are on Macs, quite likely you're not putting anything on. And there are some challenges with that as well. But if you're Windows, you're quite likely running something, maybe a Windows Defender, which comes free, or some other product to protect yourself from various viruses, worms, malware, whatever, right? So let's start at the very beginning, right? So if you roll back the clock, early internet days, when there was the small kind of community of black hats as well as white hats trying to protect, you had very simplistic attacks. You had some simple viruses, worms. Some of them were kind of mostly innocuous. Yeah, they would do some damage. They would deface a website here or do something bad. They were not really trying to monetize it in any way near the way the current attackers are trying to monetize, right? So in the early days, you had companies like the Symantec's, the McAfee's, and and various others. There was also Trend Micro. That all built a simple antivirus engine. And what does an antivirus do? They essentially collect samples of all the viruses, the malware, the worms. They kind of bring it in-house into a lab. They write some signatures for it, and they push the signatures out to every one of the endpoints. Okay? So imagine it's totally reactive. The first thing, right? So you have to collect the sample, and then you have to write the signatures. And a lot of times, the attackers got savvy. They would just make some minor modifications, which led to the next advance, which is, hey, let's come up with these fuzzy signatures. Let's not hash the whole file. We only hash some parts of the file, the executable parts of the file, so that we have a better match, even if some of the headers change, some of the bytes in the file actually change. So it's always been a cat and mouse. But fundamentally, it was a very reactive approach. Someone needs to have seen a file in the wild, capture it, write the signature, and then push it out to everyone for the whole world to be protected. okay? And this is probably okay back in those days when you didn't really have an explosive increase in the number of malware or attackers, and especially people trying to monetize. And I think people kind of mostly tolerated it. Again, I may be dating myself here, but back in the day when I had McAfee, it used to slow the system down. I would always wonder whether it's worth it. But regardless of when I was or where I was, I would always have an AV running on my systems. Now, if you fast forward the clock to the early 2020s, things started changing. And folks like the NSA and some other nation-state groups started using these vulnerabilities in software to advance their goals. A key inflection point in many ways was Stuxnet, which was actually used to sabotage the Iranian nuclear effort. And for those of you who may have not heard about it, what happened was the Iranians were developing all the nuclear material and enriching them. We tried talking them out of it, and they wouldn't listen. And then basically, I think it was Barack Obama, and he kind of authorized, or maybe George Bush, one of them authorized a software attempt to sabotage all their nuclear enriching centrifuges. So it was a phenomenal attack. There's a book, and towards the end of the talk, I'll kind of share the title of the book. Totally a lovely read that goes into all the different zero-day vulnerabilities and the way the attackers, in this case, let's say the NSA and Mossad, kind of thought about how do we penetrate centrifuges and the control software in a place that is completely air-gapped. There is no network access. How do you get into the Iranian nuclear facility and spin the centrifuges so fast while also showing the controls to appear totally normal? No one would pick it up, but by the time they noticed, all the centrifuges were kind of dead because they had spun too fast or spun too slow. So Stuxnet actually was a big inflection point in the level of sophistication of the attacks and the cyber attacks that was happening. And around the same time, in the mid-2010s, you also had the adoption of Bitcoins and everyone trying to kind of either mine Bitcoins from systems or alternatively just do a ransomware attack and pop up the message and saying, give me Bitcoins if you want your data back. So that led to a significant increase in the type as well as in the sophistication of attacks that was going on, which led to the birth of artificial or the real use of artificial intelligence in cybersecurity. And the one company that I think we should all give a lot of credit to is Cylance, and I was lucky enough to be at Cylance very early on. Now, what did Cylance do that was interesting? Cylance actually took a lot of data, and instead of creating signatures and pushing them out every time there was a new attack, they actually pioneered the use of machine learning. And the next slide, I'll explain exactly what that recipe is. So if you want to actually do what Cylance did, it's entirely possible. And many other companies have actually gone on to implement what Cylance did. But when Cylance did it, it was a totally pioneering approach. It was not even sure that they could actually pin the tail on the donkey. But they did, and they did very successfully. So let's talk about what they did. They essentially approached the idea or the concept of identifying attacks as a classification problem. So think of a young kid, and my kids are slightly older, but if you have a small kid who's 6 months old and you're showing them picture books with dogs and cats, after a few such attempts, you take them to a park and you show them any type of a dog, any type of a cat, it's very likely that they will accurately identify that cat, even though they may have not seen that particular cat in any of the books that you have shown them for the training purposes, right? Same thing with the dogs. You show them a few dogs in the picture books, you take them to a park, and lo and behold, anytime a dog goes by, they're like, yeah, that's a dog. So the concept here that Cylance actually kind of focused on was, can we make this a classification problem? Can we go after every type of attack and classify it as good or bad? So how did they do it? And this is how they did it. First of all, there is this product called VirusTotal. How many here have actually heard of VirusTotal? Show of hands. OK, that's actually better than I expected. So VirusTotal is actually a property of Google. And a lot of times, when you encounter a file that you've never seen before, you can just go to VirusTotal, register for an account, upload the file, and see what various different engines, and these are all antivirus engines, think about that particular file. And there are about 50 such engines in VirusTotal. And it's kind of a free utility. Of course, there are some premium parts that they require you to subscribe for. But you can ask VirusTotal a question. It will tell you how many of the AV engines think it's good or how many of the engines think it's bad. So this information is available. And in many ways, Cylance was actually standing on the shoulders of giants when they actually leverage VirusTotal to extract a large number of samples. So you can also pay and grab samples out of VirusTotal. And when you grab samples, you are grabbing both good and bad samples. So you essentially know how many of the tens of millions of files that you have downloaded from VirusTotal are good, and how many of those are bad. Now this becomes what is called, I'm sure you guys know way better than I do, a supervised machine learning problem. Right? So you have someone who has already gone to the trouble of classifying these files. And we would apply heuristics. So we wouldn't just take anything if a single AV vendor said it was bad to be bad. We would say, OK, at least 5 of the top tier AV vendors had to say that was bad. So we would say Microsoft, Symantec, McAfee, and maybe 1 or 2 others need to say it is bad. And if all these 5 of them say it's bad, we'll kind of say with a fair degree of confidence that it's bad. Otherwise, it's good. OK, so we now have the classification for tens of millions of files, all courtesy a few hundreds of thousands of dollars of subscription paid to VirusTotal. And then what we would do is once we had collected all this, it was very, very simple. Now, we had to kind of, before we started training everything, we also had to write parsers. And this was actually one of the challenges for Cylance, and as well as for many other vendors that actually did it. So imagine a file type. It could be ELF on Linux or portable executables PEs on Windows. It could be Marco on the Macs. And these are the binary formats, right? So you need to be able to parse the portable executables. And later on, we also did the classification for other doc types, for instance, docx, pptx, xlsx, and so on. But one of the first things that you will be forced to do if you want to do this type of classification is write parsers. And you need to write high-quality parsers that are extremely fast because you're doing inline autonomous detection of threats. So you cannot take, let's say, even a second to parse the file and determine if it's good or bad. So the parsers better be really good and high quality, and they need to be very, very fault tolerant, because no matter what the published standard is, there will always be deviations. There will be portable executables with bytes and things and headers in the wrong place and all kinds of stuff that you do not expect, but they will be there. And the parsers had to be really, really fault tolerant in order for you to be able to go extract the features and train with the features, right? So you're writing the parsers primarily to pick up the features out of the files that you have collected, and for which you know which ones are good and which ones are bad. Now, we would then train a model, and this model training would happen in the cloud, right? So out of the tens of millions of files we collected, let's say we take 1 million good and 1 million bad, we extract features, and we build multiple candidate models. It would never be a single model, right? So we would build, say, 5 models in the first attempt, and each one of them would use a different set of features to do the classification. Once we had these 5 candidate models, we would go run it against the remaining. So let's say I had 9 million good and 9 million bad that was not used in the training set. I would take the model and run it against the 9 million good and bad, and I would see what my accuracy was, because for the 9 million good and bad, I know which ones are good and which ones are bad, and I would actually compare how my model is performing against the known information, against the known fact. And I would pick the best performing model, right? So far, what we've done is we've kind of gone to the well of knowledge, that's VirusTotal. We've grabbed all the files. We've written a parser to extract the features, and we are experimenting with features all the time. Because sometimes adding 1 or 2 extra features will improve your classification accuracy, right? So once we had all this, we train multiple models, we run them against the remaining set, and then we pick a model that we are ready to ship with. We embed that model in the agent, which is the antivirus, and then ship it to everyone, including the computer that that's in my bag. So this one, this AV would react extremely differently from any other AV in the past. Earlier, all the others would go look up a database and see if there is a signature, and if the signature matches, it would tell you that it's a bad file, you are not allowed to execute. But the predictive models that we were shipping worked very differently. We needn't have seen any of these files ever before. Whenever we found a file, we go use our parser to extract features, plug it into the model, and think of the model as some kind of a math equation, and the math equation will kind of give you a score. And if the score is negative, you called it bad. If the score is positive, you called it good. And if it was bad, you prevented it from running. It was as simple as that. So everything was distilled down to a very simple math equation, if you will. Again, I'm simplifying a lot. But we created a math equation, plugged in the variables every single time, and were able to predict if something was good or bad. And that's really how this whole industry was completely transformed starting around 2014, 2015, in terms of using machine learning to completely raise the bar against our attackers. But we are in the computer science department, and for the longest time after I left here, I always thought that this was the fascinating part of building companies, of scaling companies and becoming successful. But turns out I was wrong. The most interesting challenge, and probably the most difficult challenge in building a company, is not about building this. Anyone who has a good idea can go build this, but telling the world the story and convincing them that this is an approach that will work when it is so different from whatever has happened in the past was a far more difficult journey. So here's what we did to accomplish that. And again, this is one of the things, but there were many other things that we actually did. But we actually had a demo called the Unbelievable Demo. And we would go from city to city, invite the chief security officers into a small lunch or dinner type of a place. We would have a couple of big TVs, and we would run this demo. So the demo I'm showing you, it's available on YouTube. There are many variants. But fundamentally, what it shows you is that we take a stock AV, one from McAfee and one from Cylance. We download 100 samples from VirusTotal. And these are brand new samples. So you just run a script, and you grab 100 samples. Let me just pause here, right? And some of these samples would also be kind of modified a little bit so that you go and change a couple of bits and bytes here, because that's very easy. That's one of the easiest ways to kind of overcome the classic AVs, especially the signature-based approaches. And then we would execute all 100 in a loop. And you can see how well Cylance actually protects and blocks all 100. And sometimes it wouldn't block all 100, it would block 98, and a couple of them wouldn't ever be able to execute. And you can see what happens on the McAfee system, which is to the left. So let's watch the demo, and I'll kind of give a small voiceover as we go along. And this was against the latest version of whichever product we were comparing against. If it was McAfee, Symantec, Microsoft, we would download the latest, make sure all the right policies were applied, and then we would run this side by side. It was a very, very compelling demo, right? So the first thing that we did was install McAfee, keep everything up to date. And this is Procmon, and I'm sure you guys know what it is. It kind of lets you see everything that's happening. All the policies are up to date, and then you download 100 samples and detonate it in a loop. And none of this was rigged. I was at the company when we were doing this. It was totally legit. And when these are the 100 samples that have been downloaded from VirusTotal, and they're all named after their hashes, and you do a for %i in star, do start %i. So you're detonating it in a loop, and see what happens to the system with McAfee, and see what happens to the system on Cylance. and Cylance just quickly goes through all of them, quarantines all 100, you're done. There is no spike to the CPU, and see what happens on McAfee. A number of them pop up, all kinds of shit happens, and people are totally frustrated. And sorry about the French. I'll remember that's recorded. So this is how we actually took the product to market. Every time we showed it in the big conferences, RSA, Black Hat, and people would love this. They would kind of eat out of our hands. So remember this, and this is one of my nuggets for you guys, which is for all the great software that you write, the biggest challenge is going to be selling the software. It's not the writing of the software that's going to be a challenge. So if you think you're going to spend 8 months of your time writing software, it's probably going to take 8 far more difficult months convincing someone that whatever you built is worth the time buying and using it. So this actually put us on the map. And Cylance was off to a completely great start, and within a few months, we were essentially taking out the McAfee's, the semantics. Has anyone here heard of the OPM breach, the Office of Personnel Management, which is like the HR department of the US government? So back in 2015, 2016, thereabouts, there was an attack, and let's say a foreign or a different nation actually stole the SSNs and a lot of confidential information of almost everyone who works for the US government. And it was actually one of the ways that OPM found out about the attack was using this technology, which led to the use of Cylance within OPM. And then later on, they decided to kind of part ways, but that's a different story for a different time. So we've talked about machine learning. I hope I've kind of given you a very simple appetizer, a little bit of a taste for how we do machine learning and classification of file-based attacks. And that's an important qualifier. Whatever I showed you so far works only for file-based attacks. So if if an attacker is creating a file and getting you to download and click and execute it, that's when this type of detection works, okay? But there was another very interesting thing happening, and I'm sure you guys have heard about this. There are a lot of vulnerabilities in software every day. How many here have heard of the Log4j vulnerability from the recent past? Wonderful, right? So every day, every week, every month, something new gets discovered. And a lot of times, people discover it and they don't even tell you, right? How many here have heard of Pegasus? OK. How many here knew that Pegasus could actually install stuff on your phones without you having to click a single link? Spooky stuff. Thank you. Yeah. So vulnerabilities are everywhere. This is, again, a very recent September 15th, about a month ago. Microsoft's always putting out patches, and so are other companies. And so are we, right? I'm a software company vendor, and I have vulnerabilities in my software that I'm patching all the time. And this is really how spooky it can be, right? Pegasus came out of this company called NSO Group out of Israel. And what they did was they actually weaponized exploits of iPhone and Android. So they hired all these really good kids, smart kids, who found vulnerabilities in iPhone, Android, and various other applications like WhatsApp and I suppose Discord these days. And they could actually hack into your phone without you having to even know about it. You wouldn't click a link, you wouldn't get an email, but they would be in your systems and they could be listening in on you, right? So this actually is a big deal. It's not just enough to protect against the file-based attacks. You need to protect against all the vulnerabilities of all the software on your system. Now think about how hard of a problem that is. It's an almost intractable problem because many a times you don't even know what are the vulnerabilities in the software that you're running. So we took a very different approach, and I'll kind of explain what we did. But first, let me actually walk you through the reasoning behind the approach. The approach we took to protect people from memory-based attacks, especially ones that were trying to exploit vulnerabilities, was to actually write down all the different things that someone could do once they exploited a vulnerability. So let's say everyone here is using Chrome, and just kind of play along with me for this thought exercise, please. Let's say there is a Chrome vulnerability, and let's say there's an attacker here who has figured out how to exploit that vulnerability. So they send you a link, you click on the link, and lo and behold, they have access, they have toehold on your systems. Instead of stopping the exploit itself, which, again, as a company, we felt was beyond us, maybe UW security will solve it at some point, but we felt it was just not possible for us to kind of block all types of vulnerabilities. So we went after the logical next steps. What are the things that an attacker is likely to do once they get on your system? And these are the 4 or 5 things that are most commonly done by an attacker. So the first thing they do, let's say I get into your Chrome browser, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show up the UW login and say, hey, your session has timed out. Type in your password once again. Once I have your password, I can go figure out how to kind of use it to buy stuff online or do something else somewhere else, right? So it's classic phishing, and this happens all the time. This is the easiest thing for an attacker to do. The minute they're in your browser, let's say they have a foothold on your browser, they just show up a login page. It could be a bank login page, uwcu.org, anyone, right? So, and you wouldn't even think that you've been attacked, that you've been owned. You naturally type in your password. And the minute they have the password, done, right? They can go shopping. The next thing that they would do is move laterally. So let's say they get into your chrome.exe, but they know that you're likely to kind of, at the end of the day, maybe you shut down your computer or you close all your browser windows and you'd like to start a fresh session tomorrow. They know that they're not going to be able to have that foothold for a long enough time. So what do? They look for long-lived services like various other, there are probably 15 different services that are always running on Windows, and they try to kind of either inject into the memory of those services or find a way to kind of start a DLL under those types of services. So this is called lateral movement. Now, I kind of said services/systems, but fundamentally, the first attempt is always, hey, can I move to a services.msc or one of the things that are always running so that I have a longer persistence, so that even if chrome.exe is shut down by the user, I have a foothold on the system that I managed to get into. Okay? The third thing, again, in the same pattern is gaining persistence. And there are so many different ways of gaining persistence on Windows that I've lost count. It's in the hundreds. It's probably in the thousands. Now, you would think that writing to the auto-run scripts or doing a cron job or an AT job are the most logical ones. But in Windows, you can write into like hundreds of different places of registry, each of which has its own sometimes documented and sometimes undocumented behavior. And there are certain registry places which if you write, it'll kick off or start that program when some other program starts, right? All kinds of weird shit. It's so bad that Microsoft themselves put out a program called Auto Runs that goes through the full list and helps you identify everything that is set to auto run. So if I'm an attacker, I get into your system, I'm trying to gain persistence, I write into one of these registry keys or write an AT job or a cron job or some way to make sure that I don't lose the foothold, right? Next approach, I get in, I find that there is an AV installed, and maybe it's Microsoft, maybe it's SentinelOne, Symantec, doesn't matter. I try to disable the AV. Because once I have disabled the AV, the user is less likely to notice, less likely to kind of be worried, and then I have the full run of the system. So I try to kind of disable the AV. And finally, the most sophisticated ones use what are called lolbins, or living off the land binaries. So essentially, most of the systems these days have a PowerShell built in, or a Bash, a Python, or a Ruby already available. So what you do is you set up a command and control server. Once you get onto the system, you reach out to the C2 and say, hey, give me some commands. And the command could be, hey, if you have Windows, go run this encrypted PowerShell script, right? And that encrypted PowerShell script is not being blocked by the static machine learning engine because it's not a file-based attack, right? It's all coming in from the network, memory resident, and they are executing the attack and stealing your data or encrypting your data and then holding you to ransom. So these are some of the most common patterns of post-exploit behavior by attackers. So instead of saying, hey, we're going to stop every exploit attempt, we said, OK, exploit attempts by themselves are not bad. What's it going to do? It's going to give them a foothold or a toehold on your system. That's totally OK. But now let's look at everything that happens post-exploit, and let's go about reducing the aperture, reducing the number of things that people can do post-exploit. And that's what we did in terms of what we call memory protection in the product. And again, this is a continuously evolving area of research for us. But we've done a lot of work to, again, raise the bar for the attackers so that they cannot just send you a link and pop into your systems and do anything that they wish to do, especially the newer products such as what I'm selling at SentinelOne. So that brings us to 2020s and where we are today. We hear a lot more about supply chain attacks. There was a very notable one around SolarWinds maybe a year or so ago, and there have been a couple of others too. So people are very worried about supply chains being infected or being disrupted, and attackers coming in that way. There's a lot of living off the land. LOTL is the same as LOLBIN that I referenced earlier. And there's a lot of scriptless attacks. And this is why companies are now starting to use more behavioral machine learning, as we call it. And the difference is, remember the cat and the dog example when I said, hey, when shown a few pictures of cats and dogs, a kid learns to kind of recognize cats and dogs. But sometimes cats and dogs look very similar to one another. And what do you do in those cases, right? Is this a cat or a dog? And sometimes you can tell, sometimes you cannot. So then you start looking for their behavior, because only cats have retractable claws. Only cats meow, or for the most part, I would think. You start looking for behaviors when the program is executing. This is an inherently more complex thing to do, because in the case of static file-based machine learning, we extracted the features a priori before it was even executing. We got a yes or no answer, and we blocked it. But in this case, you are allowing the program to run, and it could spawn any number of sub-programs, sub-processes, and you have to have a very clear idea of how they are all related to one another. You have to really observe their behavior, and then somehow put that into a machine learning model that kind of tells you a score and keeps updating the score every second, every millisecond, whatnot. So that's what we do very uniquely at SentinelOne. But this being our secret sauce and recipe, I cannot get into the same level of detail I got into how static AI models are built. But there is a little bit of science, a little bit of art, and a little bit of heuristics all going into it. But this is really our calling card, which is the use of behavioral machine learning to really determine when a running process or a group of processes are behaving in a malicious way or not. So that kind of is the meat of the technical material I wanted to present. So I will kind of leave you with a few suggested readings and videos. And I've kind of given the slides to Nick, so I'm sure you guys can get a copy of it somewhere. And these are all great books. The first book is a very recent one, and it actually is a compendium of the evolution of cybersecurity attacks and attack patterns over the last 10, 20 years. It's a very well-written book, and I would highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in cybersecurity. Countdown to Zero Day is specifically focused on Stuxnet, right? It's like a 300-page book that gets into all the level of detail that you can probably get about how Stuxnet was discovered, how they reverse engineered it, how they figured out how many 0 days or exploits were actually used in Stuxnet. How did they actually do the jump across the air gap into the nuclear facility of Iran? How did they sabotage all the nuclear machines or the centrifuges? And then there are a few other suggested readings, some of which are from our blogs and some of which are YouTube videos. And then my final 2 slides. And hopefully, if you don't remember any of what I've covered so far and just kind of benefit from my last 2 slides, I would be a very happy man. And this is something I've kind of learned the very hard way after spending 20 years in Silicon Valley. They say strategy is a very complex word. Most people don't really understand strategy, but they kind of use the word strategy in their life, in their professions. They talk about, hey, this is not strategic, that is strategic. What is strategy? And one of the best books I've read over all these years on strategy is Playing to Win by the ex-CEO of Procter & Gamble. It's a terrific, terrific book. Highly recommend anyone who's interested in thinking about corporate strategy to go read this book. But if I have to distill it down, it boils down to two corporate strategies. There are only two viable corporate strategy choices at the highest level. The first one is build a differentiated product. And that's what we are all doing every time. So you write your essay for applications, you are trying to differentiate yourself to the computer science department admissions committee and tell them why you are different, why they should select you. When CDIS calls it a red talk, they are trying to differentiate themselves from a TED talk by saying, hey, this is where we bring technology and humanity together. When I am presenting this talk, I'm trying to differentiate myself from just doing a pure technical talk by giving you something that's beyond a little technical, right? So differentiation is all that matters. Most of the time, and almost everything that we do, if we want to win, differentiation is the way to go, because the other alternative is not something most of us can pull off. And that is being the low-cost leader. And remember, there can only be one low-cost leader. There's only one Walmart. You cannot have multiple Walmarts, right? So again, if you were to look at corporate strategy, one of my best lessons over all these years is when you're building products, either build differentiated or shoot for being the low-cost leader. And being a low-cost leader is not really what most of us care about, most of us get excited about, and it's really not our core competence. But being differentiated is something that we all do, consciously or subconsciously, starting with your application essays. So do differentiated stuff. And my final slide, again, I was in corporate America for a number of years. I thought we all had to work hard and 18-hour days, and I was surviving on 5 hours of sleep for a number of years, and I thought that's how corporate America works, right? And they kind of have you, let's say, they kind of, you are an indentured laborer for them, right? And you have to really work hard in order to make it big. But turns out, I was wrong, and I was wrong on a number of counts. Lack of sleep can be really bad in numerous ways. I've put a few items here. And this book actually kind of explains in greater detail about all the harmful effects of not having enough sleep. And it took me a couple of years to kind of, so one, I read the book a few years ago. I realized my follies, and I said, I have to sleep 8 hours a day. And it took me at least a year to go from 5 to 6 hours a night to 7, 8 hours every night. Now I cherish my sleep. It's not something I'm willing to kind of compromise on. And even with 8 hours of sleep, I feel I'm far more productive, I'm far more creative. And especially for people in grad school and undergrads here, you may think you're kind of working hard and producing more by compromising on your sleep. And sometimes a good night's sleep, you'll wake up the next day and solve the problem that you were having trouble debugging. So sleep well, my friends, and I hope this is insightful for you guys. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for some questions.
So when you're at Cylance and you're trying to get that product out in the market, and you mentioned your demonstration, how did you choose that you put in that room to demonstrate to, and how did you get them into the room?
Yeah, so the question is about how did we choose the people to show the demo to, and how did we get them into the room? So most of the time, again, this is a very well-funded Silicon Valley company, right? So we had Khosla Ventures and a couple of other big names. We had millions of dollars in the bank. We had a very compelling and strong marketing team. And we also had a number of our working relationships. We knew the CISOs at various different places. We would call them in and show them the demo. Or we would go to conferences like RSA. So in security, there are two main conferences that everyone attends. First is RSA, which is typically in San Francisco. Second one is Black Hat, which is typically in Las Vegas. So almost all the major people, especially people with budget, show up to these two conferences. So what we do is, you just hire a nice, fancy hotel room, bring in a lot of refreshments, and make it worth their while to come and talk to you for 30 minutes. And when they're talking to you, you just quickly do this demo.
So what role do you think this technology will play in terms of
The question is about how or what role this technology plays in geopolitical attacks. I think to a certain extent we have raised the bar high enough, especially for our customers. They're no longer getting breached. They're no longer getting compromised as much as many of the other accounts. But again, all the products with the latest technology are still so underpenetrated in the market. We are probably at less than 10% penetration. Okay, maybe best case 20% penetration. So if I'm an attacker, I'm still salivating at the prospect of, hey, there are 80% of the people in the world that are very easy pickings for me, and I really don't need to worry about figuring out how to disable a SentinelOne. So the SolarWinds attack, there's a very nice blog article on our website where we did the reverse engineering. And there were about 8 different products that they were not trying to disable, one of which was our own. We were very proud of it. And the other one was CyberArk. There are probably about 5 to 8 products that they chose when they found they don't even want to, they went cold. They didn't even activate the beaconing. They didn't try to activate the payload because they knew it was going to be harder, right? But things are changing. As more and more of the market starts using the more advanced technology, I'm sure the attackers will start figuring out how to use maybe machine learning to overcome our algorithms. And look, our algorithms are not bulletproof. They're largely probabilistic. They are definitely an improvement over what we did earlier, which was very reactive. Now we can be very predictive. However, as with all algorithms, we have holes, and I'm sure sooner or later attackers will find a way to kind of overcome them. But I believe for the customers, the 10, 20% of the overall space, the addressable market that we are protecting, we are keeping them far more protected than any of the previous products have ever been able to do so.
You said that Stuxnet kind of changed.
Absolute yes on the second question. So the two-part question there. The first question is, why do I think Stuxnet changed the landscape? The second question is, does the government hoard or have weaponized capability? And of course, the answer to the second question is yes. The first part answer would be that before Stuxnet, I don't think any nation state actually did such a sophisticated attack and showed what can be done. Here, we were struggling to negotiate with Iran and figuring out how to prevent them from building nuclear weapons, and someone just calls NSA and the Israeli guys, and they just go and get it done. And you don't have to negotiate with Iran. You don't need to kind of do any haggling. It's all very cleanly done. Not a single drop of blood spilled. Beautiful outcome. But the minute we let that genie out of the bottle, every nation that is worth its salt started hiring hackers. Now everyone is weaponizing. Everyone's buying exploits in the market. Okay, an exploit for an Android may go for as much as a 2 to 3 mil price tag. If you have an exploit for iPhone, it probably goes for even. Actually, iPhones go for a smaller price for the simple reason that the iPhone market is less fragmented, because most people upgrade their iPhones. There are probably only 3 or 4 major versions of iOS that are running, whereas Android is heavily fragmented, right? Everyone's running their own different version. So the Android exploits are a little more pricier, but if you have an exploit, go sell it and make some good money. One way or the other, someone else is going to find it anyways. Yes. Yeah, the question is about how we came up with this way of showing our product. And I would give most of the credit to our CMO and maybe the CEO at that time, Greg Fitzgerald and Stuart McClure. They were really thinking about how do we make a splashy way, how do we kind of capture the imagination of people. And some of it was experimentation. We were doing this without the scripting. We were doing it by hand during various demos in the early demos. And then we said, OK, what if we scripted it? What if we put it on a screen? What if we actually took it on a road show? What if we got tens of people to sign up? So I think it was iterative, but most of the credit goes to the CEO as well as the CMO. There's a question there. So first, I was not a founder. I was just an employee. But we were about 5 to 8 people that were trying to commercialize Condor. I think the biggest reason was the number of people who have the type of problems that can be solved by high-throughput computing in the commercial world are just too small. It's a very, very small addressable market. So you had some of the EDA vendors like Synopsys, the memory makers like Micron that were using HTC. When I was here at UW, we were using HTC to do all kinds of stuff, including gene mapping. And I was working with the physics department, and we were actually on the hunt for the Higgs boson. Remember, it was discovered recently. But we were actually hunting for the Higgs boson back in 2000. I was part of the experiment that was running all the simulations on Condor. So there are a lot of scientific uses for HTC. But when it comes to the commercial world, we need answers a little more quickly, right? We don't have the luxury of the SCHED waiting to kind of match it to one of the free computers and then run and then get results back whenever it does. So numerous challenges, but if I have to boil it down, it was too small of an addressable market. So if you're trying to build something, pick a very large addressable market. Even if you miss it, you'll hit some part of the board. Yes? Yeah, so that's a good question. The question is about, I spoke a lot about detection. I didn't really talk about response. And I kind of cheated a little bit, right? I simplified my presentation. I didn't actually cover an entire area and a part of the industry that is called EDR. And think of EDR as almost a black box in an airplane where it's recording everything. Every keystroke, every network connection, every DNS resolution request, every file activity, every registry change. And that's what I have running on my computer. That's what, we protect 3 of the Fortune 10 accounts. And they have it on every single computer. I was at Epic earlier this morning, and they protect their hosting infrastructure using SentinelOne, right? 40,000 systems. They're running SentinelOne with the EDR capability, which is that black box, which is tracking every single thing that's happening. You sneeze, we know about it. And we're collecting that data, bringing it into the cloud. We're collecting over 4 petabytes of data every day. And we store it at least for 14 days. For most customers, in some cases, we store it for extended periods of time, up to a year. So the volume of data that we're managing is immense, hundreds of petabytes. We are actually the largest Kubernetes account for AWS, okay? The largest. So the volume of data we collect and the way we provide that response capability all starts with the data, because the telemetry tells you what happened. Did anyone get in? How did they get in? What did they do? Did they modify a file? Did they reach out to a certain IP for command and control, and so on? You can trace it all back. And then there are response actions that are built in, and I can provide some pointers into how it's all automated and how it's done these days. So EPP has evolved from the simple reactive signature-based approach to incorporate many of the AI elements I talked about, as well as including this black box technology, where we are tracking everything that's happening on your systems.
Host privilege here.
Sure.
Can I ask one question? So what are the open problems that the security that will
No, there are many, many interesting problems that are truly unsolved. I'll start with probably the one that kind of interests me the most, which is to use machine learning for scripts, right? So you have PowerShell, you have Bash, Python, Ruby, whatever. If you guys can come up with a machine learning model, much like how we did the machine learning for static executables, if you can figure that out, that's gold. That's total gold. It's completely uncharted territory. No company that I'm aware of is trying to do that, right? And this is something that I've been discussing with Ramsey as well. There are a few other variations of that, but that would be a total pot of gold. And even if you did replicate whatever we did in the past, there is a lot of value, and maybe that's something we can discuss when we go for a chat. And essentially, my feeling is the commercial vendors have figured out how to build the static AI models, but there is absolutely a place for a total open source, publicly available classifier that I hope Wisconsin will build, and I'm happy to support that effort in a small way. And if we can put that in VirusTotal, we start picking up a lot of credits. So if there is a new attack that the Wisconsin classifier says is bad before all the others are saying, and anyone who wants a classifier, instead of saying, hey, I'm going to build a classifier myself, they just come and say, hey, Patrick, I'm just going to write you a check. Here is $1 million, and I'm going to consider it as royalty, but I'm going to use it in my security product. There's a lot of value in it. So there's a lot that can be done, and I hope I'll be able to contribute a little bit to those efforts.
So let's thank Raj one more time.
Thank you.
As a token of our appreciation, and welcome home.
Thank you, sir.